A pleasure to me all at last, and welcome back to Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again. And this time, we are going to be going from Pixar to DreamWorks, which was started by Jeffrey Katzenberg, a former Disney executive who tried to claim the position of CEO after the previous CEO had pretty much gone out. And Michael Eisner was not proud of what Katzenberg had tried to do to pretty much abuse power within the rankings of the Walt Disney Company as a whole, and so Katzenberg was forced to resign as a whole, eventually starting a competitor group known as DreamWorks, and even suing the Walt Disney Company for promised royalties that had never been received. Hundreds of millions of dollars ended up getting put into DreamWorks because of this lawsuit. But in any case, DreamWorks was able to successfully put together several films that not many people got to know about, including Ants in 1998, a couple of Bible films in 1999 and 2000, and then, of course, in 2001, they ended up making their first ever masterpiece, one that had in fact last year been inducted into the Library of Congress. It is now as culturally significant as a lot of other films out there these days. Even Citizen Kane, called Shrek. Yeah, right there. That's pretty much what you need to know right now. This is in fact a part of the Library of Congress nowadays. And it is just unbelievable how it got that big, yet it took this long for them to put it into the National Film Registry, just like that. And I'll tell you what, there's a lot of people out there who might propose some serious arguments or disagreements with this, but it is in fact a masterpiece. Just think about it. This was released in April 2001, just a few months before Monsters, Inc. would premiere in theaters. But Shrek did a lot more than just give Disney and Pixar a run for their money. DreamWorks was in fact able to make an enormous merchandising deal and even promote the crap out of a lot of different artists and bands, especially with its vast soundtrack composed of most songs and the like from artists and bands like Smash Mouth, The Proclaimers, and it even had itself a pretty amazing hit that probably nobody will ever forget, which was in fact a cover of the Monkees' I'm a Believer. And that of course didn't happen until the very end of the film, but nonetheless, the soundtrack, casting, animation style, and a ton of other unique aspects about this one movie alone were just many reasons why it became a phenomenal success in 2001. And even all the way to today, people are still talking about it like it's the greatest thing ever made. But it really just goes to show that all sorts of people out there who are fans of a terrifying giant green ogre whom is Scottish and voiced by the same old Mike Myers, whom we've known from other things out there like Wayne's World, for example. But we certainly cannot forget the fact that it's not just the likes of famous, iconic actors from back in the day, like Mike Myers, Cameron Diaz, and then of course the likes of Eddie Murphy. Man, who would have thought? You certainly do have a lot to work with, because this is in fact just another way of telling a lot of the famous fantasy stories and fairy tales that were all out there by the time this film was released. Generations upon generations of simply putting together all sorts of big time stories that have been known for generations at a time. They all come together in this one film, so it's essentially like a CG crossover of all these different stories that we've ever come to know about. The Three Fairies and the tales of the many other things that we have had for a long, long time. And this movie really does capitalize on those things very well. But we do get to see a lot more than just a simple combination of such well-beloved characters out there from these fairy tales, including the three pigs and the big bad wolf. And then we have ourselves the fairies, the godmother, and many other unique attributes that come from these well-known stories. Shrek is in fact the story of a terrifying ogre who lives in some weird house, who basically is hated and even feared at times by just about everybody in the swamp. Everybody at all who lives on this one land always has fears for such a big terrifying ogre like Shrek. But at some point in time, Shrek one day comes across a donkey who is able to talk and even run away from a few captors. And so it eventually comes down to the fact that now Shrek has to deal with the talking donkey, who constantly makes some pretty hilarious comical references and plenty of other pieces of dialogue that we never would have expected Eddie Murphy to pull off so well. But yet we do eventually get to the point where the real story begins to kick in. One night, Shrek and Donkey are simply living on the swamp when all of a sudden, a lot of uninvited guests come along. Enormous groups of squatters, as they are referenced as, eventually just converged onto the swamp, and it got so heated up that eventually Shrek demanded to know exactly what had happened. It was revealed that apparently Lord Farquaad had apparently put up eviction notices and sent them all off to Shrek's swamp. How on earth that even happened, we'll probably never know for sure. But the whole point is that Shrek now has to deal with all of them. And if, well, all these guys were to be removed from the swamp, then all that has to be done is that Shrek needs to go out to Lord Farquaad's palace and demands that each of these squatters get removed. This fascinating tale just doesn't really end here, because eventually upon arrival, we certainly do see some exciting action. A sort of wrestling match that takes place with a group of knights in Farquaad's palace. And then, of course, we certainly can't forget the fact that it all ends with Lord Farquaad getting a little bit more cryptic and telling Shrek that apparently the quest doesn't end just like that. Apparently, Farquaad has a request for Shrek to do. To go to a castle far, far away and rescue a princess. Oh. Well, okay. That was a bit unexpected, but anyways. As I was saying, John Lithgow's character, Lord Farquaad, has to become a king by marrying a princess. But this is not, in fact, just any princess, because according to the magic mirror on the wall, apparently there were only 3 known selections for an eligible bachelorette for Farquaad to marry to: Snow White, Cinderella, and Fiona. Farquaad ends up choosing Fiona, and as such, after Shrek and Farquaad meet, they end up organizing a deal to where Shrek can take over the quest that Farquaad is scheduled to go down to head all the way over to an ancient castle, which is guarded by a dragon and surrounded by a moat made out of lava. And so Shrek and Donkey infiltrate the castle, accidentally awaken the dragon, but manage to rescue the princess successfully. But after Princess Fiona learns about Shrek's true identity as an ogre, it is unfortunately the thing about it that just makes it so funny. But after some time together, they eventually make an agreement that they can all go together back to Farquaad's palace. And as such, throughout the next 20 to 30 minutes of the film, this is pretty much where we see a true character arc begin to build. A relationship between the different main characters begin to take place, and we do get to see a lot of emotional aspects, as well as a lot of clear understanding in terms of a difference between a human and an ogre. Shrek, of course, realizes a lot of this as it begins to take place. And Princess Fiona, of course, begins to do the same thing, while Donkey continues to give us those strange old shenanigans like Eddie Murphy always does. But unfortunately, Fiona has a very terrible secret. At night, Fiona actually turns into an ogre just like Shrek. And so it unfortunately becomes clear that this is the sort of thing that will not take place. It will not go down well for Lord Farquaad, and as a result, they try their best to ensure that their marriage does not take place. So in the end, once they find out that Fiona's true secret is becoming an ogre after dark, the public is in fact shocked of this. And Shrek does in fact try to do whatever's possible to explain all this. But in the end, Farquaad prepares to have them both. Wow. Would you even want to know at this point? But then of course we get to the very end. The climax, of course, which involves the dragon, whom is in fact under a bit of a friendship with Donkey. They're both able to successfully defeat Lord Farquaad, and Fiona gets to find love's true kiss, which is in fact done so by kissing Shrek, and therefore being locked in the ogre form forever. And so that's just pretty much the point where they live happily ever after. And as such, well, this is where we can all agree that for a film that had itself a budget of $60 million and grossed 8 times that amount, it's no wonder why many people call this an everlasting success. A lot of merchandising had gone into this film. It had great cast members. It had a soundtrack worth a lot of songs that have been licensed out, thanks to DreamWorks' continuous ability to spare no expense when making high-budget films like this. And in any other case, you could look at the story being quite unlike many others we've seen when it comes to talking about different fairy tales. But you know what though? Just to keep it real here, and also because I have a limited window in terms of production for this kind of content, let's just talk a little bit about the sequel from 2004, Shrek 2, pretty much. This was certainly one that I've gotten to know about very well, especially because there were a lot of movies I had from around that time on DVD and VHS, even though VHS was dying out by this point. This was pretty much shown up as a trailer almost all the time. But when you really think about it though, the sequel to Shrek is in fact a bit overwhelming at this point. Because with the fact that they were able to gross nearly $500 million in the box office from the first film, it's no surprise that DreamWorks does in fact intend to make a sequel to this. After all, looking at it now, the whole thing has become a very successful franchise, grossing a few $billion in the box office in total from all media possible, and beyond. But in terms of Shrek 2 being the sequel to Shrek 1, it's hard to imagine where you can possibly continue, but yet there is in fact a way. Not all fairy tales are in fact taken upon with DreamWorks' imagination when it comes to creating a successful plot, a story, and a pretty intriguing amount of characters, voiced by many different well-known actors from this generation. Of course, we do get to see the likes of Mike Myers, Cameron Diaz, and Eddie Murphy make a grandiose return. But picking up from where the first movie left off, rightfully so, Shrek 2 does give us a bit of a honeymoon spectrum in which that Shrek and Fiona are riding in a horse-drawn carriage that is shaped like an onion for some reason. Donkey annoys them every step of the way, and they have a very, very, very long trip that apparently takes a long time to do so. But in the end, they arrive at the kingdom of Far, Far Away. The kingdom of which that Fiona's parents actually live in. They were in fact invited to spend some time together. But unfortunately, the king and queen of this kingdom do not actually realize that Princess Fiona has in fact been struck with a curse. And after finding love's true kiss, which is again permanently locking Fiona in the ogre form once and for all, it does become apparent that apparently a lot of things have to be done in order for them to successfully get to this destination on time and also in an easy manner. But there's also a lot of other dilemma that takes place here as well, because while this kingdom is in fact inviting them over for dinner and the like, a meetup with Shrek, there is in fact another thing that takes place here. The fairy godmother, whom is also willing to try to do anything possible to see what can it pretty much be done. But I will admit that at least for a sequel, this does pretty well. Not necessarily as good as what we've seen from the first film, but yet it's something that I'm willing to turn my eyes onto as a seeker a little more often than with the first one. And then of course we certainly cannot forget about the ending, by all means. There's a lot of stuff that takes place here. A lot of new characters are introduced, and a lot of new big plot twists take place. And not to mention a few parodies of famous scenes in other movies and television shows. As a matter of fact, that's what they do a lot with the sequels, as opposed to what we saw with the first one. But in any case, Shrek 2 was pretty dang good. But yet, there is a 3 and a 4, believe it or not. And not to mention a lot of other expansions. And so, I will be back here tomorrow to do just that. To talk about the third and fourth film, as well as everything else associated with the franchise known as Shrek. This was the first ever franchise that DreamWorks had ever done that was so successful that it grossed billions of dollars worth in the box office on all counts. So if you want to see more go down to my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.